Okay.
Oh, we're going over there?
You know, I think that it's even with papers. You know, if you want to.
That's fine, it's fine.
So you mean, so your timing is to work here? Because I didn't time my remarks. What's the best way to time?
Well,
You say, right, I know. But
nobody does. So at about 12 minutes.
you hold that up.
I'd rather not do.
We're going to go to the
Well, they're doing the training.
Are you leaving immediately afterwards?
No, I don't have to rush out.
Okay.
You can praise us after. Georgetown sign, they're not in front of you. Yes, it's good. It's a replacement.
We all learned to do that many years ago. We've had the U.S. ones that don't do that.
So they can't cut it out. It's been on one side. It's probably different names. It's not for what we say. It's one that right down.
Oh, here it is. Well, let us start the second session, if we will, please. My name's Tom McNair. I teach in the Security Studies program at Georgetown. And I have anticipated this panel in particular with great interest because as sort of your typical American national security analyst, I think of China as a rule breaker more than a rule maker, and I think it's a stroke of genius to sort of put this panel here so we can talk about the other side of that coin. And to do that, we have three really terrific, experienced panelists. I'll introduce them in the order in which they're sitting, which is also in the order in which they're speaking, with the only admonition that we do try to hold to 10 to 15 minutes, which, as I told the panelists, it's just impossible. Nobody speaks for just 10 minutes, but I'd like you to really give it a try. Susan Lawrence is at the Congressional Research Service, where she's an Asia specialist. She lived in China for 13 years, most of that as a journalist for the likes of the Far Eastern Economic Review, Wall Street Journal, the U.S. News and World Report. Fluent in Mandarin, and I think probably fluent in the way China sees the world and sees itself as well. Robert Daly is the director of the Kissinger Center on the U.S. and China at the Woodrow Wilson Center. Came down there just last year from Maryland, where he ran the China Project, but about 11 years in China, including 6 directing the Nanjing Center, which I regard as a very special place. Again, fluent in Mandarin and has interviewed and translated for, interpreted for several Chinese high-level officials, American high-level officials. Patrick Clausen, like me, is not fluent in Mandarin. He's fluent in Pentagonese, which is an equally different tonal language, and it's hard because it changes all the time. Those acronyms just keep getting longer and longer. He is now Senior Director and Director of the Asia Program at CNAS, the Center for New American Security. If you look at his longer bio, you'll see he's been in a number of places and has always written very, very cogently about U.S. national security, in particular about Asian issues. So with that, let me turn this over to Susan, and we'll get started talking about China as a rule maker.
I'd like to start by thanking Georgetown, Oriana, and USIP for the invitation to be here. And I'm speaking in my personal capacity, and my views don't necessarily represent those of CRS. This panel is on China as rule maker. The framing language that you will have seen in the brochure about the conference seemed to assign two meanings to that phrase. The first one was China as joiner, as participant in the international system, epitomized by its decision to join most international and regional organizations. And the second meaning is China as rule maker in the international system in the sense of playing a leadership role, actively proposing changes to the international order. So I'm going to split my remarks into those two categories. Starting with China as joiner. China has been an enthusiastic joiner in recent decades, making up for time lost as the junior partner in the Sino-Soviet alliance and in the aftermath of the Korean War. China, of course, joined the United Nations and took on the seat on the Security Council held by the Republic of China, Taiwan in 1971. Its membership in international organizations picked up after 1978. It has now joined most UN-affiliated agencies, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and so on. It began efforts to join the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade in 1986, and finally joined the GATT's successor organization, the World Trade Organization, of course, in 2001. Nonetheless, for most of the time since 1971, China has often been described as under-participating in global governance. A 2009 study by the Center for American Progress described China as in the ring, but punching below its weight. Chinese scholars have characterized China's role differently as admirably restrained. Chinese scholars sometimes seek appreciation for the fact that China has generally not sought to use its UN Security Council seat, for example, as a way to counterbalance or block the United States. One imperfect metric of China's activity may be vetoes in the UN Security Council. China cast its first veto in 1972, blocking Bangladesh's UN membership because China considered Bangladesh to be a breakaway province of Pakistan, its ally. But it didn't use its veto again for 25 years, until 1997, when it vetoed a resolution to send ceasefire observers to Guatemala because of Guatemala's diplomatic relations with Taiwan. And China abstained on the 1991 Gulf War resolution, allowing the Gulf War to happen. They voted for the ultimatum to Iraq leading up to the Second Gulf War. They voted for Resolution 1386, authorizing the International Security Assistance Force in Afghanistan. So China sort of basically wants credit for not blocking the United States with that position. But of course, the list of vetoes doesn't reflect situations in which China wielded influence with its threat of a veto, or otherwise may have informally influenced the behavior or actions of other members. Moving on to China as rule maker. Many observers have remarked on an apparent gradual shift in China's attitude toward the international system in the last few years. A desire to move cautiously beyond the Deng Xiaoping dictum of Tao Guangyang Hui, this idea that China should keep its head down, not take the lead, focus on domestic development. And that dictum has been in place since the fall of the Soviet Union. It's still officially there, but there's now a lot of debate about how much China should feel guided by that. We're seeing senior Chinese officials indicating a desire to pursue gradual changes to the international system. An example, November 2013, last year, State Councilor Yang Jiechi, China's most senior diplomat, stated that China wants to, quote, pursue incremental progress in adjusting and reforming the international system. That appears to mean preserving the authority of the United Nations and the World Trade Organization, but wanting the UN to renew and improve itself and play a bigger role. It means securing a greater role for emerging markets and developing countries in the global system, for example, the G20. China really likes the G20. Reforming the international monetary and financial systems to give China a bigger role. Ensuring a global development agenda that is firmly focused on economic development and poverty alleviation and not on promoting democracy, democratic governance. China is also engaged in a parallel effort to create new institutions in which China can be a rule maker from the start. One example is the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Its mission includes, quote, moving towards the establishment of a new democratic, just and rational political and economic international order. Principles of the SCO include ideas like respect for the diversity of cultures, which is a byword for not pursuing democracy promotion in places like China. It's also got a major focus on tackling what the SCO countries call terrorism, separatism, and extremism. And that, of course, just that formulation reflects China's role as a rule maker in this situation. China, of course, uses that phrase, the terrorism, separatism, and extremism, to justify its actions in places like Xinjiang and Tibet. And it calls those three things the three evils. And yet, the SCO, all of the SCO countries have signed on to that focus. And the SCO countries, Kazakhstan, China, Kyrgyz Republic, Russia, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan. Observers are Afghanistan, India, Iran, Mongolia, and Pakistan. China's also seeking to be a rule maker in the context of the BRICS, the BRICS grouping, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. It has established the China-Africa Cooperation Forum and now expanded on. We now have also a China-Arab Cooperation Forum, and looks like this year there will be a new China Community of Latin American and Caribbean States Forum. So basically the three major regions, China is now setting up specific entities for China's relationships with those whole continents. China has also, under Xi Jinping, is pursuing two very high-profile initiatives which China is portraying as an example of the way that it is beginning to innovate in foreign policy and create rules by being the innovator, by being the country that's putting out these ideas. So one is the Silk Road economic belt, proposed when Xi Jinping was in Kazakhstan. The other is the 21st Century Maritime Silk Road, which is leveraging the China-ASEAN Maritime Cooperation Fund, which China established. That was proposed when Xi Jinping visited Indonesia, and I think we're going to be hearing a lot more about those two initiatives in the months to come. They're becoming very high profile in China. Part of the shift in China's approach to the international system is in statements saying that China is willing to step forward and shoulder greater international responsibilities, which is something the United States has long urged China to do. Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, for example, last fall pledged that China would fully and more actively involve ourselves in international affairs and work closely with other countries to meet intricate global challenges and tackle difficult issues facing mankind. He promised to provide more public goods to the international community. As examples of China's provision of public goods, China points to its active participation in UN peacekeeping missions, points to its anti-piracy operations in the Gulf of Aden, its diplomacy related to North Korea, and in August, China will be hosting the ministerial conference of the Istanbul process on Afghanistan. China's also said it's willing to get more involved with Afghanistan. Another area in which I think we'll be seeing more Chinese activity, which may lead to more rule-making, is China's pledge to do more to protect the interests of Chinese overseas. There are now 100 million Chinese traveling abroad every year, 20,000 Chinese companies operating overseas, and China is now much more overtly making this part of China's foreign policy agenda. And finally, part of the shift, China is now casting more vetoes in the UN Security Council. So from 1997 to the present, you remember from 1972 to 1997, there were no vetoes. From 1997 to the present, China has used its veto 7 times, 5 times following Russia's lead. The last 3 vetoes in 2011 and 2012 were on resolutions championed by the United States related to Syria, of course. But China abstained on the UN Security Council vote on the Crimea issue, which Russia vetoed. So I will put that out here. I think all 3 of us are going to be talking on kind of different aspects of this question, which is good. And we will then discuss how they all mesh. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you. I'd like to thank Oriana for putting this together, and also to congratulate you on the structure of the day, which is very enticing. As I went through your schedule, I was very glad to, I hope, have the time to be here to listen to the other panels as well. It's a very good conference. When I was given this topic, China as a rule maker, I had some of the same thoughts. China hasn't proposed that many rules as such. And so I went back, as I often do if I'm looking at something in a comparative context, United States and China, to etymologies to try to see whether we meant different things in English by rule than the Chinese do primarily by guizi, because it's often the case when we speak, for example, of education and jiaoyu, that they're fundamentally different concepts. Interestingly, etymologically, notions of rule and guizi are quite similar. They both come from the idea of making straight and from measurement and delineation initially. Now, the processes of rule making in the United States, broadly internationally, and in China are quite different, particularly with reference to notions of who gets to participate. But what I wanted to focus on, and here thinking back to the first panel and to Professor Wang Zheng's comments in particular, is the degree to which rules are culturally construed in both the Western and the Chinese tradition. They are not static. Rules evolve to reflect changes in values, technologies, and power relationships. And so we tend to, I think, overall in the United States, we tend to describe and to judge the efficacy of rules based on whether or not they form the foundation for human flourishing and for human interaction, including economic interactions, security interactions, et cetera. Does the rule provide a good and fair foundation from below for human activity? Whereas in China, it's more often the case that a rule is seen as imposing order on chaos from above. And we often run into this difficulty when we speak of international rules and the question of whose notion of what rules are for is going to predominate. So that in some of the examples that Susan Lawrence just gave of China as a rule maker, I think there is a question in some of these institutions, these organizations, these policies, whether we are really talking about rules as such or as mechanisms for power projection and influence on the Chinese side. And so it's tough to make these distinctions all the time, but it's worth, I think, making the effort. Earlier, you spoke also of the culturalist lens through which China approaches these issues, and I think that's correct in the case of rules. Rules are also designed to create and to perpetuate a culture. And often this function of rulemaking is not explicit, but it can be. And I'm thinking, of course, because Georgetown is sponsoring this event with the Institute of Peace, we have the rule of St. Benedict, the rule of St. Augustine, the rule of St. Francis, and of course the rule of St. Ignatius Loyola. And this once common, now less common notion of a rule is a way of life that enforces a discipline, schedules, rituals, declarations of faith, in order to cultivate certain virtues, certain practices. Actually, the whip that was used in some of the harsher orders for self-flagellation, that was actually called the discipline by the people who used it. And so this notion of the rule as perpetuating a set of disciplines and cultures is not altogether unknown to the CCP in its histories. This is another sense of rule that I would like to bring in. So rules, I think, are inseparable from values and from cultural practices, which is one of the reasons that we've had so much difficulty in working with China on this front. This week in the States, of course, we've seen this in the U.S. We've been debating rules about affirmative action, about land use rights in the Clive and Bundy case. My last comment on that, but I think that in talking to China, or with China, about its role as a rule maker, we need to bear in mind the inadequacy, the inconsistency, and the changing character of our own rulemaking. So what are China's attitudes toward the making of rules to date? We don't have a whole lot of evidence to go on, although it was somewhat encouraging just this week to have in Qingdao a new agreement reached on a non-binding code of maritime conduct. It's encouraging. We'll see how it goes. We can also look to China's recent international behavior as a clue to its attitudes toward rulemaking. And I think that certainly over the past year or so, the evidence there has been far less encouraging when we look at the East China Sea and the South China Sea, where we have declarations of interests rather than rulemaking activity. And as its power grows, another ongoing indicator of China's attitude toward rules is China's own domestic laws. It is becoming clear, I would argue, that China's first instinct and preference in treating problems and people beyond its borders is to treat them as it treats problems and people within its borders. This isn't unique to China. It's not really very surprising. But that kind of treatment often can threaten established and emerging international norms that much of the rest of the world regards as essential to the functioning of modern nations. And indeed, I would argue many of these rules are essential to China's own efforts to develop an innovative knowledge economy. And so there's a tension that we see in China, and Professor Zhu Feng referred in the first panel to this paradox between a desire to be involved, a desire to be integrated, a desire to benefit from international rules, which are sometimes at variance with the domestic rules that are very strongly enforced by China. We see a paradox in that China's domestic standards, for example, treatment of individuals, treatment of labor, the environment, the free flow of information, protection of intellectual property rights, Chinese attitudes toward the rule of law and the role of law are not commensurate with established international norms. And China experiences this as a big problem. It describes it as its problem in controlling discourse, 话语权. It sees very little room to defend or promulgate its own standards for rules that it sees working for it domestically, internationally, because the discursive field is already occupied. It's hard for China to step out. And that is why I think that what kind of rulemaker China will become is going to depend on its ability to resolve this sort of nay, why, internal or domestic, international paradox, which is what I understood Zhu Feng to be referring to. In other words, it is Chinese exceptionalism, China's uniqueness, which we discussed in the first panel, which, like all exceptionalisms, doesn't meld easily with principles of international law. And the attempt to work with China as a co-rule maker is further complicated by Chinese views toward its foreign policy, deeply held beliefs among Chinese elites, but also among Chinese people more broadly, which were also referred to in passing in the first panel. The belief that China is fundamentally and characteristically peaceful, that it never has and never will threaten a neighbor. Therefore, incursions in the Scarborough Shoal cannot be threats. This is the argument. It is also strongly believed that China also respects nations and peoples and never interferes in the internal affairs of other countries, that it does not seek to change the systems of other nations, that Chinese foreign policy is always correct, and that China is never at fault in international conflicts. This makes it, this belief, which I think is fairly deeply held in China, and which I'm sure many of you have encountered in the past, and if you haven't, I'd be happy to send you some speeches and articles that make this point. But this disposition that China is never at fault, is always peaceful, this makes it more than usually difficult for China to accept international judgments, whether they're from the WTO or, for example, with the case that the Philippines is bringing about the Spratlys. How are we going to reconcile these deeply held beliefs about China's correctness with international judgments? Furthermore, China, it is believed, as a historical victim, is incapable of being an aggressor. The very suggestion is almost oxymoronic from the Chinese point of view. Xi Jinping at Davos in 2014 said that China will never seek hegemony because, quote, this is not in the DNA of the country given our long historical and cultural background. So these beliefs about Chinese foreign policy are going to make it, I say, difficult, these ideas of Chinese exceptionalism, for it to make and co-design rules as such. On the other hand, that's sort of the negative side of the equation. On the more positive side, China is aware that it is changing. When I first went to China as a diplomat in the late 80s, and I would, unfortunately, embarrassingly, preach to China in those days about all the things it should do, my Chinese friends would say, well, 这是个过程, this is a process. And of course, this is very tough as an American because it's so transparently an excuse and it's so undeniably true at the same time. So it makes it sometimes tough to have these conversations. But certainly there's a very healthy discourse among Chinese policymakers and in the universities about the fact that China needs to integrate, as had been mentioned. China is also understandably uncertain about what it wants and where it is headed. I was in a panel yesterday with Jia Qingguo of Beijing University, and he made this point strongly and quite convincingly, that one of the reasons for China's silence about its desires and rules is that it doesn't know. China is changing very quickly, and we spoke earlier this morning about the need for empathy, and this is, I think, one of the areas where we have to exercise it some of the time. So this uncertainty is one of the things that is making China a hesitant rule maker. It is conflicted, and so it rails against the supposed injustices of the existing world order, even as it games that order with great success, and increasingly now recognizes that it is a beneficiary and therefore that its interests are to refine, certainly not to overthrow that order. Yuan Peng of the China Institutes for Contemporary International Research writes about this in a book I'd recommend called Debating China, a series of dialogues about major issues in U.S. China relations. And Yuan Peng wrote, "China itself has not yet made adequate psychological and strategic preparations for changes in the international system." Therefore, quoting, but from a separate part of his article, "China will continue to play the role of constructive participant and gradual reformer." And I don't think that we will see this changing in the very near term. So this question of what China becomes as a rule maker is really inseparable from questions about China's modernization and integration into a rapidly evolving world generally. Its rulemaking, I would not expect its rulemaking capacity to get out ahead of other aspects of 对外开放 and its opening policies. So, in closing, how should the U.S., faced with so many international problems, the need to work closely with China economically and across the board, but we're dealing with a China that is uncertain, although it's quite comfortable declaring what it doesn't like about the existing rules, but it's uncertain about proposing new rules. How should we best work with China? First, I think that it is incumbent upon the U.S. and other countries to make clear to China that it is welcome as a participant, an active participant in the rulemaking process. We do not expect it to be just a responsible stakeholder, a phrase that to the Chinese means we welcome your rise as long as you play by the existing rules. China does have a legitimate interest in refining those rules for a changing world, and I think could have something positive to contribute to them, although it hasn't really begun to do so yet. So looking for ways to work jointly with China and to try to listen to China is going to require, I think, a humility and a patience on our part that doesn't always come naturally, even as we have to insist on upholding certain fundamental principles. I think the best way to have these dialogues with China is to try to focus in rulemaking with China in areas where China recognizes that it has equities and where it can come to rulemaking not as a latecomer, but more or less as an equal. It's a good idea to start on new frontiers. There aren't so many of those. We have them in space, and we have them obviously in cyberspace, and the new frontiers for rulemaking come to us now mostly not from geography, but from technology. Rules about the human genome, for example, and how that is going to be treated. Questions, technology raises privacy questions internationally that China recognizes as such, as it potentially impinging on the rights of individuals. These are very good opportunities to work with China as an equal, as rule makers, where some of the paranoia that was described earlier can tend to drop away. So I think there is room on the positive side to work with China as a rule maker, and I think it's essential that we do so. On the negative side, China, as has been mentioned, has this idea of 大国主义, of big country relations and big country prerogatives that would sometimes seem to preclude rulemaking in the normal circumstances. We don't always agree with China on the rules for rules. We disagree about rules in the first instance, and we sometimes disagree about what constitutes a rule. Should a rule, for example, on the use of EEZs apply equally to all countries? This is something China has difficulty answering. So China, as I say, to date remains largely silent as a rule maker because of uncertainty, because it has problems with discourse. I think it doesn't know how to express its desires without sometimes frightening people. And also, I believe, because it sees time as being on its side. It sees America as in at least relative decline and China as rising, and therefore the later China declares a rule or makes a deal, the better the deal China is likely to get. These Chinese attitudes toward rule-based order, I think, have serious strategic consequences in the immediate term that we have to deal with. But the underlying challenges for China are cultural, and cultures change slowly. The CCP's default attitudes toward rules are still based on self-interest, maintaining order, maintaining discipline, and on maintaining virtues that are idiosyncratic to the Chinese system. And as the Benedictines and the Franciscans know, that really doesn't work so well except in the cloister. When you're opening to the outside world, it's a little bit tougher, and that's where we have to work. Thank you.
Well, good morning. I'm Patrick Cronin. I'm the Senior Director at the Center for New American Security, and it's great to be back at the U.S. Institute of Peace and with Georgetown University Security Studies program. I've worked at both institutions. They're tremendous institutions, and I think today's event shows just how strong their current program is as well. I think Oriana asked me to talk maybe a bit more about the specific security issues we face today. I've tried to cover some of the same ground as the two previous speakers who've done a better job than I've done, but I will, just for the sake of letting you know my outline of an article I'm finishing, give you at least the punchlines, because I see China as a partial rule maker and a partial rule breaker. Going back to Tom's earlier point, yes, they break the rules as well, and they also make them, and sometimes they just are not interested in the rules, breaking them or making them. When you think, I've tried to ask three questions. One is, what does it mean to be a rule maker? And I think one of the points I'd make here is that from an American perspective, you'd expect predictability. You'd expect transparency, and you'd expect a sense of fairness. And without those three qualities of predictability, like the 9-dash line, does it apply to land features? Well, maybe, maybe not. There's no predictability. There's no predictability in this issue. How about transparency? Well, there's no transparency either, because you can't really see inside China's decision-making. It's so difficult. There's so many actors. I hesitate to ever say China as a rule maker, because what is China? And is there a sense of fairness? Well, from a Chinese perspective, yes, but it's historically based. And that's so rich, as we just heard, that it's very difficult to try to put that in our, especially American, but more generally Western context. So that's why I want to move on to a second question about the scope of rules being made, because I think it really is important to differentiate the kind of rules we're talking about. And so when we focus on the hard issue, the neuralgic issues between, say, U.S. and China on security, and between China and some of its neighbors on security, especially the maritime domain, but you can increasingly bring in issues like cybersecurity, you start to see the pattern of Chinese rule sort of making and breaking. There's no doubt that China is looking at this as a justification for power projection as much as rules. I think, as Robert just suggested, that is to say, it's both. They're interested in the rules, but not if it touches upon and infringes upon what they think are core national interests. And that's a loaded term as well, because that could be changing as China reawakens maybe old claims, not necessarily new claims, but new interests in old claims is leading to a greater desire for influence over those old claims, where this new awakened power of China, again, the 9-dash line, also the East China Sea, including the air defense identification zone, can be seen as sort of an extension of China's conscious power projection toward its near seas, not necessarily out of an imperious desire, but what they think is a historical right. And that's why this rights movement in China is becoming a more dominant strand of decision-making influence than, say, ideology. Chinese clearly prefer bilateral agreements with smaller neighbors and they don't want binding sort of agreements, certainly through a multilateral mechanism. Those seem to be true throughout all their negotiations on security. We can certainly talk about this with respect to the Philippines, Scarborough Shoal, in terms of moving the Philippines out. They used, of course, the rationale that the Philippines brought in a Navy ship, which was a very, very old American Coast Guard cutter, dressed up as the Philippine Navy ship, to sort of enforce domestic Philippine law on poaching. And that allowed China to justify moving in their civilian law enforcement agency ships and basically control now Scarborough Shoal. They've also moved, in terms of Second Thomas Reef in the Spratlys, to stake a territorial claim over a submerged feature, a land feature, which doesn't offer any territorial claim because it is submerged, and yet they're taking on the Philippines on this issue. And they're also, as Robert mentioned, not participating in the International Tribunal on the Law of the Sea arbitration case, at least to this point. They can do so at any point over the coming months or even years. This may play out through 2016, but they don't really want to get into a binding arbitration through that international mechanism. They prefer to deal with this bilaterally between the disputants, between the claimants, and they want to have the binding agreement bilaterally that favors the Chinese sort of point of view. In the East China Sea, where you have a bigger power, Japan, here the Chinese made it very clear to me, at least in many meetings, most recently in Australia last week, that they will not sign up to kind of confidence-building measures and risk reduction measures that are meaningful with Japan until Japan makes good on acknowledging the dispute, acknowledging some Chinese dispute over administrative control over the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands. Islands which now President Obama has just clarified U.S. policy, but not a new policy. It's the old policy. But he's articulated as President of the United States to say that Article 5 of the U.S.-Japan Mutual Security Treaty does indeed cover territories administered by Japan, and we recognize that those islands are administered by Japan because when we reverted Okinawa and the islands back to Japan with a 71 agreement that started in 1972, we said, Japan, you now have administrative control. So that's just a statement of fact. It stops short of saying that's a sovereign claim. It simply states the facts according to post-World War II history from a U.S. perspective. Nonetheless, it's likely to flout Chinese expectations. So Chinese will compete and will raise up the temperature even more on this issue, just as they did with the Air Defense Identification Zone last November, where they took a legal mechanism, a legal right to have an ADIZ, but they used it when they were not happy with the United States sort of supporting the normalization of Japan's defense posture, the 2+2 agreement between defense and foreign ministers last October, where the United States basically got behind Prime Minister Abe and said, yes, we support this. And now those statements have become even stronger and more clear in the statements that just came out of the summit meeting in Tokyo. So you can expect that this rights diplomacy from China, this competition, this unwillingness to engage in serious hotlines between Japan and China will grow. Now, you're saying, but we're just reading these stories about the Code for Unplanned Encounters at Sea, CUES. Yes, well, let's talk about CUES for just a minute and put that in context. So this is actually less rigorous than the binding regulations that are already on the books that the Chinese and Americans have signed up to, among others, the coal regs, which go back and have a standing in international law that are binding, and they apply to military and civilian shipping alike in terms of avoiding these kinds of dangerous incidents. CUES is voluntary. Chinese immediately came out and said, by the way, they're not only voluntary, but they don't apply to internal territorial waters. Well, what are internal territorial waters? Is it the 9-dash line? Well, you haven't clarified what you mean by the 9-dash line, so we don't know. So the lack of predictability, again, is an ongoing problem and dilemma here for China as a rule maker. Now, it does help symbolically, though, so it's a good thing. Everybody up here, I'm sure, wants to encourage China to be more a part of the international system. We're trying to encourage this kind of rulemaking, participation, and we're trying to figure out where's the middle ground. How do you get to the happy medium? But they can't be rules at the expense of others. And so that's why this Western Pacific Naval Symposium, which is one of the major de facto institutions in the maritime space across the Indo-Pacific region, is an important opportunity for China to show that it is interested in joining the rules and making those rules. It's a good sign symbolically. We're about to host them for the very first time as a participant in the Rim of the Pacific naval exercise this summer. So it was very important for China to join CUES before the RIMPAC. But again, as I say, this is not the Incidents at Sea Agreement between the US and the Soviet Union in the Cold War. Those were serious, professional maritime documents that applied to surface and air domains. Not to submarines, by the way. Why? US submariners didn't want any rules in the stealthy subsurface. That's another issue altogether. So, there are rules, and, when you make the rules, you can kind of make the rules cover the issues that you want to cover. And the fact is that, frankly, subsurface, surface, and air, not to mention cyber and space, are all going to be more competitive in sort of in the years ahead in these issues. We also touched on earlier the exclusive economic zone, and the interpretations differ between China and the United States when it comes to naval activity within the 200 nautical mile limits. China has a minority view on this that's shared by a few other countries that it's pushing, but it's doing so within the scope of international law. That is, it's our Chinese interpretation that you should not be able to conduct spying essentially inside our 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone, because UNCLOS, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, says that you have to pay due regard to coastal countries. And the Americans and most of the other nations who follow UNCLOS, even though we haven't ratified it, blight on us, but nonetheless, we follow, as an executive law, UNCLOS principles and customary law, and we think that, no, you're allowed to conduct this kind of peaceful activity. We think peaceful activity, not hostile activity, inside EEZs, and other countries are allowed to do it within ours, as they did during the Cold War. Anyway, so this is a long way of saying that China's a partial rulemaker. It's conditional. It is seeking power projection as much as rules. It's seeking greater influence. It's also seeking to keep the outside world, the periphery, calm. That's why peripheral diplomacy is more important than some of the global rulemaking that the United States is interested in. I could, if there were time, talk as well about some of the cyber. I will just mention that it's interested that the multilateral aspects of Chinese cyber policy are with like-minded countries. So the recent agreement that China was pursuing was with Tajikistan, Russia, and one other I've forgotten. But in any event, more like-minded countries on this issue, and they've resisted kind of strong U.S. China cyber rules of the road. But it is a contentious issue. It will be hotly debated. Look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
I just want to thank the panelists for allowing me to sit here comfortably and not get up with my little 2-minute sign. They did that voluntarily. I'm not an intimidating person. They did that. So thank you very much, which leaves us about 15 minutes for questions. And we have the usual rule that Oriana articulated earlier. Identify yourself first. We have mic. Wait for the mic. Identify yourself, then ask your question. Where I can't. Oh, okay. This presupposes I can see the hands, so put them up.
Good morning. My name is Rosemary Seguero. I'm trying to ask about the China relationship with Africa and the rule of law into Africa, since we are talking about the world. How do you look at that and the long-term relationship or partnership with Africa and China, looking at business and humanity and security? How do you look at that, and how can Africa or China get into that relationship looking at a long term? Because many times China is in Africa and they are doing a great job in Africa, but when it comes to manpower, you find they are bringing in their own manpower. How do you make that as a rule of law to the African on the continent with China relationship? Thank you.
Anybody want to? Susan,
can talk.
we'll go right.
Sure, we can all talk a bit on this. There's actually there was an interesting project that ran for a number of years that I found quite intriguing. It was sort of coordinated by the World Bank and working with the OECD and with an entity in China, basically trying to give China feedback on its involvement in Africa. So I think there were 6 African countries involved, and there were a series of conferences, and the idea was they started by doing this big study, I guess, of China's development and the lessons that it might have for Africa. And then after that, they had these sessions where African countries got a chance to give China some of the feedback that you're mentioning here, about, for example, countries wanting to not have China bring in all the labor for projects and actually to use local labor, or standards, worker safety, other that at mines and so on. I mean, there's been a series of sort of controversy around some of these issues. So that I think was a useful exercise. Unfortunately, the Chinese entity that was involved in that wasn't an entity that was sort of in a position to do a lot, I guess, to change China's approach to some of these issues. China is, of course, very sensitive about the criticism of some of its activities in Africa. The Chinese, I think, sometimes have been accused of sort of neo-colonialism, which they strongly resist that characterization. And China actually sees as a real positive the fact that it goes in without any political preconditions, unlike the United States and other OECD countries. It's also a topic that the US and China are discussing. There is an effort to try to get China to sign on to some of the OECD rules on development assistance, for example. And that's been part of the US China SNED, the Strategic and Economic Dialogue. There's a piece of that which has been looking at development assistance and ways in which China can maybe start merging its practices, or not merging, but making its practices accord better with the practices of other countries. So sorry, but Robert, you have things to say.
Well, I would just say that it's as you suggest, it's changing quite rapidly. China has become a big power. It now has international, worldwide interests, and as it pursues them, it's encountering some of the difficulties that America, as a fellow large country, has had. And so it's having to revisit, as you see in the Ukraine, where it has sacred principles on either side of that dilemma. And so it keeps a distance and it professes, these vague principles, but it doesn't get involved because suddenly it's discovering why the United States has always had what it calls double standards, because it has interests in a big, complex, evolving world with limited information. And so China is acclimatizing itself to this, and you feel it in Africa where, yes, initially China was very proud that, for example, in the South Sudan, that it didn't come in with political preconditions. On the other hand, the foreign minister, Wang Yi, I think just in either February or March when he was there, did call for peaceful resolution. That was a big move. That was a slight adjustment to this policy. I think it was positive. I think we should welcome it. So it's changing. China is discovering the essential big country flexibility / hypocrisy, double standard, whatever they wanted to call it. And there's an acclimatization to that process in Southeast Asia as well, where it's building high-speed rail, also using mostly Chinese labor. The countries that are transited don't feel that they're getting the benefits that they should. And so China had this wonderful soft power opportunity because it's extending really vital infrastructure in Africa or Southeast Asia, but then it doesn't get the soft power benefit in many cases because it tends to hold on too tightly. But it is learning, it's changing.
Well, 10 years ago when I was working with the Chinese government trying to help them on adapting OECD rules, they clearly were expressing a strong interest, but at the same time, they revealed their fragmented decision-making, that is, their bureaucratic politics, who was in charge of the development policy, the fact that state-owned enterprises might be making a key sort of exploitation of resources in a country, would be driving policy, and they wouldn't touch that. But they clearly are interested, and I think, as Robert has just suggested, they've made a lot of progress in the last 10 years. U.S. policy has to continue to work with both developed countries, OECD, and developing countries to put pressure on China in a good way, give them incentives to be part of that and of decision-making at OECD and to make those rules. They're more inclined to go along with these when they see some benefit because they're not touching, as a general sense, their direct core national interests. Their indirect interests, sure, about their economy, but they see their enlightened self-interest. The problem is when you have weak governance in a state, and I'm thinking like South Pacific Islands, forget about Africa, where it's very tempting for a leader in a South Pacific island to say, just give me that one big infrastructure project that's what I want. And it's hard to get the transparency that you would want in an international development project. So helping the international community and OECD can work with developing countries to enforce transparency and raise those standards. And I think China will keep moving in that direction.
Thank you. How about right here? Denise? Remember to introduce yourself, please.
Thank you. Dong Huiyu with China Review News Agency of Hong Kong. My question is for Mr. Cronin. You mentioned that as a lawmaker, he should be transparent, he should be credible. But we often see that as a lawmaker, the United States policy actually has a lot of ambiguity. For example, in terms of the Senkaku and Gaoyu Islands issue, President Obama just affirmed the U.S. Principle, but in terms of the detail, he fell short of clarifying the detail of this issue, how to defend the Gaoyu Island if there's any emergency over there. So my question for you is, as a credible lawmaker, how to keep the balance between the policy, clarity, and the flexibility? Thank you.
Well, this is a panel about China as a rulemaker, so I restrain from spending my 12 minutes talking about the United States and its ability to be a rulemaker or a rule breaker. But sure, the United States is ambiguous at times. All policymakers, in fact, prefer to have some executive ambiguity and leeway in policymaking if it's possible. But at the same time, I think the United States is making a concerted effort to strengthen and adapt an international system that we largely contributed to building post-World War II, and that includes in Asia-Pacific through the United Nations, but also through institutions like the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. And sometimes I think that the Chinese approach to ASEAN is to see it as a sandcastle that they can kind of keep divided and it'll be very weak and they can pick it apart. Japan is a tougher nut, and when the United States sides with Japan, China's in a very difficult position about how to press its claims and its influence. The ambiguity you see over the Senkaku Islands is the fact that the history is ambiguous. I think President Obama has done as much as possible for any American leader to articulate clearly what the U.S. interest is. He wants a peaceful resolution of the dispute and expects it. But at the same time, he acknowledges that it is under administrative control of Japan and that our treaty stipulates that we will support territories administered by Japan. So he's stating all the facts. He's talking about peace. He's looking for cooperation. He's encouraging Japan to reach out to China. We have a very strong U.S. China strategic dialogue. But unfortunately, these disputes are not going to be resolved. They have to be managed. That's why the United States prefers serious risk reduction measures. But as I mentioned in my talk, China prefers to employ a bit of risk here to press its claims and doesn't really want to enter into a binding agreement with Japan in particular. With the United States, it's a bit different because they see us as co-equal sharing the Pacific. And they'd like to sort of enforce that principle, that idea at least, symbolically. So it's an important, difficult problem. China has legitimate claims, but we don't know how to adjudicate those. And it's not for the United States to say, this is definitely Japanese sovereignty, but we can say definitely, this is the treaty, this was the reversion treaty, this is our policy. And by the way, we want everybody to resolve this peacefully. So let's make sure we figure out ways to do that.
Thank you. My name is Zhang Hong from China's Caixin Media. We have been talking about rulemaking, but I think the other very important aspect of rulemaking is rule enforcement. So the U.S. has been able to be a rule maker is partly thanks to its capability of rule enforcement. So can you talk a little bit about the capability of China of enforce the rules, whatever rules they want to make? From this aspect to analyze this issue. And also, I would like to hear about your because I'm particularly interested in the BRICS, because I think among all the platforms that Susan laid out, outlined, BRICS perhaps has the biggest potential as a global platform for China to sort of become a global player or global power compared to all the other more regional ones. So what have you seen? What kind of vision have you seen that China developed through this platform? Thank you.
First, I think we need, in terms of China's ability to enforce rules, I'm not sure if you mean enforce rules or defend interests. So I think we've got to keep on the definitions of what we mean by rules and international rules in particular. And in terms of enforcement, and I'll just give a very brief answer and then kick it over. I think it's interesting in many cases we see that the United States and China, while both talk a fairly strong multilateral game, both for different reasons, are not inclined to give up any sovereignty in order to strengthen international enforcement mechanisms. China has sort of 寸土不让, this idea. The United States, again, for different reasons, you see this in the Senate in particular, is not inclined to yield power, which is seen as sovereignty, to international organizations for enforcement purposes. And this is something that we have in common.
I mean, just on enforcement, I mean, obviously, this is a huge issue internally in China. This question of trying to enforce anything. And that's a problem. I mean, it's interesting when we're talking about rulemaking, this conference is about rulemaking in the international environment, but Robert was saying, you sort of start with the domestic environment and then you move out. And, and internally, China, as we know, has tremendous problems with rulemaking and rule enforcement because of issues of overlapping jurisdiction, different levels of authoritativeness of the different regulations and laws that come out, the power of local governments to sort of push back and pick and choose about which rules they want to follow and which ones they don't, and so on. But when it gets to the international level of, I guess, is your question about enforcing rules that China's made, is China then able to enforce? And I guess what we're saying is that China hasn't made a lot of rules in the world. It's sort of gradually, cautiously easing towards the position where it would be starting to make more rules. But it's not really then China's, if something like this, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, I mean, that's an organization where China has been very active in developing the rules of that organization. Then enforcing those rules, I think, is probably a matter of those countries being like-minded countries and being committed to the same set of goals. So therefore, that maybe isn't such an issue of enforcement. Sorry, that's a bit of a waffle, but.
Yeah, just a brief different point on my concern would be the lack of international enforcement. I think there's a dissipation of enforcement. That is, the United States has less capacity, perhaps less interest. And other countries, including the BRICS, have not yet stepped up because of a lot of reasons to this, but they will protect their interests. So we see in Crimea, we see chemical weapons in Syria, we see sanctions not followed against North Korean proliferation. There are lots of challenges. How do we enforce the rules? Who's enforcing them? And what I worry about is that if there's no enforcement, there's a great incentive to break the rules. Not from China necessarily, but from others, as we see with Russia, I think, and Ukraine.
I see a lot of hands rising, but it's noon and lunch calls. So let me try and draw this excellent panel to a close. In some ways, I think I've been trying to think of ways to extend Oriana's marriage analogy, and I'm just going to drop that. Thank you very much. But I see this as a transition to this afternoon's panel. I mean, Susan actually did identify some areas where China's making rules. And to go to the marriage, this is where the couples go to separate rooms and decorate the room the way they want, right? The SCO, the heck with you, I'm going somewhere else. Robert, I thought, was more how hard this is for China, and in many ways, as it is for the United States. We're both exceptional countries. We have very different but very powerful histories that shape our approach to the world. And then Patrick, I think, more expressing the skepticism that I expressed initially about how difficult this is when the married couple really has to deal with one another. There's just a real problem there. So it's a nice transition into this afternoon's session on China as a rule breaker. First of all, I want to thank, we've extolled the beauty of the room, the wisdom of the agenda. I agree with all of that. I'd like to thank the Institute of Peace for electronics that are unobtrusive and work. And even though this is the information age and you'd think that would go without saying, it often doesn't go that way.
If we're going to continue this marriage metaphor through the day, I would like to interject that it was an arranged marriage. There was no courtship. We didn't fall in love. We didn't choose each other. It was circumstantial, and we went to the bridal chamber as strangers, and there were surprises. So it's still an unfolding. So I don't know how far we want to push this.
This afternoon's moderator, you're entirely excused from picking this issue up ever again. Now, okay, I am enjoined to tell you that to get to lunch, it's out that door. So you come down and out to the right, and those doors are just opening right now. Thank you to the panelists. That was excellent. That was just...
I had a lot of things.
Actually, yes, okay, well, no, I want to take the, okay.
National power of growing consequence. It's addressing that role, we think, with increasing seriousness and beginning to see the benefits that accrue from more engaged multilateralism. China, for example, has been a key participant in the Iran nuclear negotiations. It's worked to help resolve the brutal conflict in southern Sudan. Like many others in the international community, China is also facing up to hard choices in framing its policy on North Korea as well as on Ukraine. Clearly, though, we still have our issues. Tensions in the South and East China Seas worry the United Kingdom and Europe as much as they do our friends here in the United States. Others in the region are concerned about China's greater assertiveness and what they see as a lack of transparency in its military development. We think that the best way of dealing with these issues is to engage frankly and constructively. The United Kingdom doesn't take a position on the underlying issues of sovereignty in those seas, but we do encourage all countries in the region to build mutual trust, work for stability, and settle disputes in accordance with international law. Here too, our voice complements that of the United States. Like America, Britain wants to strengthen the rules-based international system. That doesn't mean seeking to impose our ideas on China. It does mean working with China to shape the international order bilaterally, but also through institutions like the United Nations, the WTO, and the International Monetary Fund. As my friend and our very distinguished Deputy Secretary of State, Bill Burns, noted in a speech to the Asia Society a couple of weeks ago, out of today's crisis in Europe comes an important opportunity, a powerful reminder of the enduring value of commonly accepted rules of the road and a regional architecture of cooperation that will benefit the entire Asia-Pacific. And he added a little bit later, all countries, big and small, stand to lose if rules are devalued, dialogue breaks down, misreading and misinterpretations multiply, and fear and tensions spiral. We too profoundly hope that out of present tensions, important lessons will be learned. Among the most urgent of the international issues we're facing is climate change. The world needs China to act on the environment, just as we need other big emitters like the United States and the European Union to take action. People of China know better than anyone the urgency of dealing with pollution in air and water. Environmental degradation is estimated to cost China almost 1/10 of its GDP and suppresses life expectancy in the north by more than 5 years. Here too, the United Kingdom sees itself as a natural partner for China. We were the first country to set legally binding emissions targets. We are a leader in renewables and low-carbon economic growth. Already the UK and China are sharing expertise on offshore wind power, carbon capture and storage, low-carbon manufacturing. China, the United States, and the European Union are respectively, as we all know, the world's first, second, and third biggest emitters. All three are increasingly aware that substantial progress on a binding global deal can't be made unless we agree amongst ourselves. And last month, the European Union hosted bilateral summits with heads of government from the United States and China and agreed to strengthen cooperation in this area with them both. And we hope to see more of this working together in the run-up to the Paris conference in 2015. The problem is urgent, the need for action is global, and our knowledge and experience are complementary. We also think that we can find common ground with our Chinese friends in cyberspace. Like most countries in the world, the UK is extremely worried about cybersecurity breaches and theft of international property. Good cybersecurity is now vital to prosperity around the world, including in China. We should use that mutual interest as the basis for progress. Last month, we held the first UK-China cyber dialogue, and we hope that these discussions will form the basis for mutually beneficial cooperation in the future. Our cultural links are also key to bringing Chinese and British people closer together. We're proud to have been one of the first 3 countries to establish a people-to-people dialogue with China. The British Council, the cultural arm of our diplomacy, is one of the leading providers of the English language in China and of English language examinations. Almost 300,000 Chinese tourists visit Britain every year, despite the fact that in Mandarin slang, Big Ben is sometimes called a big stupid clock. British television exports to China went up 90% in 2012 alone, thanks in part to China's insatiable appetite for Downton Abbey. In 2012, 30 million Chinese viewers watched the royal wedding live on television. We're not quite clear yet whether Chinese viewers prefer the US or the UK version of House of Cards, but I hope that neither is taken as too literal a rendering of how Western democracies really function. Then there are our academic exchanges, which are increasingly high-tech. The UK is now China's second largest foreign partner in academic research. Peking and Manchester universities, for example, are developing a partnership in genomic medicine. The University of Nottingham has established a center in Guangdong that will train 2,000 Chinese financial specialists every year. And of course, like the United States, we are welcoming more Chinese university students to our shores. Last year, they totaled 130,000, about 6 times, I think, the total student body of Georgetown. But we also want our own young people to learn more about China. We plan to increase the number of Brits studying or gaining work experience in China to 80,000 a year by 2020. As Confucius says, it's delightful to have friends visit from far away. As more Chinese tourists, business people, and students visit Britain, we hope that they will be impressed by the value and resilience of an open society. We know from our own historical and current experience that the most successful economies are the most open ones, and that an open economy requires an open society. Both Britain and China have made international commitments to uphold human rights. Both are members of the UN Human Rights Council this year. We believe those rights underpin peace and prosperity globally as well as locally, and it's in that spirit that we continue to engage China on the issues that concern us. When we've seen signs of progress, for example, on arbitrary detention, judicial reform, family planning, we say so. But we still have our concerns, particularly around freedom of expression, the treatment of human rights defenders, religious freedom, minority rights. We have not shrunk from voicing these in many ways, including at the highest levels. Like the United States, we have no desire simply to nag or preach from the sidelines. In any event, I doubt whether it would be very effective. But at the same time, we will not and should not ignore issues of legitimate international concern. We want to see a strong, stable, prosperous China, and that's in everyone's interests. And we think the best way to achieve that is for China to strengthen the rule of law, increase rights and freedoms, establish greater transparency. Lao Tse, classical poet and philosopher, once wrote, "The more prohibitions rule all beneath heaven, the deeper poverty grows among the people." We know from our history that the inverse is also true. The more freedom people have, the more prosperous they will be. By far the biggest beneficiaries of greater openness in China have been the Chinese people themselves. In one of his first speeches on becoming General Secretary in 2012, Xi Jinping said, "Our people expect better education, more stable jobs, better income, more reliable social security, medical care of a higher standard, more comfortable living conditions, and a more beautiful environment. They hope that their children can grow up better, work better, and live better." Remarks which could just as easily have been made by President Obama or my own Prime Minister. People in Britain, America, and China have the same aspirations, and we have a common interest in helping them reach those goals. Early this month, my Chinese counterpart, Shui Tiankai, stood on this same podium and commented, "No country can confront all challenges single-handedly. If we don't cooperate, we will probably be overwhelmed." And he added, "Cooperation in areas where we agree helps deal with areas where we differ." I don't think Britain or America need fear China's emergence onto the global stage. We can clearly work together on those issues. We must simply proceed with pragmatism and deliberation. Or to put it another way, as the Chinese experts might say, we need to cross the river by feeling the stones. Thank you very much for your attention, and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ambassador. That was excellent. And we have about 15 minutes, I think, for some discussion up here at the podium. I was struck by your comment that Britain, like the United States, has a full spectrum relationship with China, from cyber and nuclear issues to people exchange, human rights, North Korea, trade. And there are a few countries in that club, and it's a very comforting thing for the United States that Britain is one of them. And we have certainly come a long way from the early 1780s when American diplomats sent to Canton were instructed to make sure the Chinese knew that we were not British and that we were much more reliable. And the Chinese court records show that the Chinese figured out that indeed we were not British, that we were very earnest, but we were somehow dumber. I want to ask a few things. I was very struck at your linkage of TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, with TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and the idea that an EU-China free trade agreement, not just a bilateral investment treaty, but a free trade agreement could someday become a reality. And it occurred to me that we have potentially a convergence of these major trade agreements. Right now, China, of course, is not in TPP, and of course is not in TTIP, but TPP is premised on agreements in the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum that we would move towards a free trade area of the Asia-Pacific that would notionally include China. So it's interesting in China in the last year or two how the debate has evolved from seeing TPP as some kind of encirclement or containment framework, and rather more like the WTO, an opportunity for China to use external developments to leverage and get change and reform within, and to benefit, as the way you described it, from standards across the globe. So I wonder if you could say a bit more about how you see the evolution of all of these things, TPP, TTIP. Is there room for China? And if so, is it going to take so long we need to think a little bit differently about a framework for cooperating with China and harmonizing standards in the meantime? Because in our Congress, I can tell you, as you no doubt know, these trade agreements are like going to the dentist with no Novocaine. So it may take some time for a formal Chinese participation. But are there things, is that the right direction to go? And are there things we could all be doing with China in new frameworks to get us closer?
Well, we think it's the right direction of travel. I think you're quite right, Mike, that over the last year or so, thinking in China on all this has evolved. I remember hearing from Chinese friends deep expressions of concern when we first started talking about TTIP. And because there was also TPP which was going on, and there was a sense of potential exclusion, was this all about ganging up against China and so on. And I think that thinking has evolved, and certainly we think that even for those countries, China obviously notably one of them, not directly involved in these free trade negotiations, there is the potential of enormous economic benefit. The figure that I gave in my remarks just now is an estimate of what the economic advantages can be if we are able to use these global free trade negotiations as a means not just of reducing tariffs and improving bilateral trade between the signatory parties, but also setting global standards on different issues, and products, many of which are, of course, manufactured in China. That means lower costs for consumers. It means more single product lines. It means that we might one day, for example, agree that a turn light on a motor car sold in America could be orange as it is in Europe, or red in Europe as it is in America. I prefer orange myself because I think it's safer. But there are, and why can't we have the same standards for airbags in America and Europe, which we can't apparently at the moment? But maybe one day we will have if TTIP becomes a reality. So I think, even for those who are not in the room of these negotiations, there are major benefits, especially for big manufacturing countries, from lower costs, more limited product lines, and the setting of global standards and mutual recognition also of professional qualifications from which we can all benefit. And indeed putting together global regulatory frameworks which can make, I think, trade more attractive and should facilitate more growth at the global level. Our sense is that at a time when global economic recovery is so fragile, which it is at the moment, even though we're quite proud of the fact that the IMF tell us we're going to be growing at 2.9% this year, which is better than most Europeans, where are we going to find this growth and jobs and security and more wealth? Answer, through knocking down the barriers to trade. It's win-win. The economists tell us that we could look to somewhere between 1.5% and 2% additional net GDP growth on both sides of the Atlantic, leaving aside the TPP Pacific Rim countries, if we had a comprehensive free trade agreement. That must be a prize worth having, particularly when you think that Europe and the United States, for example, account for half the world's GDP between them. And that's, that's just one of the two negotiations. So we think it's going the right way. We hope that this will get going. We'd like to see fast-track authority granted by the United States Congress before too long. It doesn't really matter too much that it's not there now, but we hope that later on, perhaps after the midterms, who knows, maybe even before, though that's perhaps unlikely, that we will see that. And that will be a clear indication of intent, I think, from the United States that the US as well is serious about this business.
How do we manage global governance now with not just China, of course, but South Africa, India, Brazil, and so forth. But China is the biggest and most challenging and fastest growing. How do we manage global governance? We grew up, most of us, in a post-war world where the G5 and then the G7 managed these large global financial, economic, and even political issues. We've democratized that, reflecting the distribution of economic power to the G20. You spoke favorably of China and Asia having a larger share in the IMF, which I appreciated. I'm not sure that's a consistent view across Europe, but it's important. But at some point, do we lose something by expanding the membership and losing the core values that the US, the UK, the original members of the G5 and G7 brought to this management of the global economy? And it comes up when people debate whether or not, for example, China should be in the International Energy Agency or in other places. What's the right balance? How do we time that?
I think this global architecture, global governance issue is an enormous challenge for all of us. Clearly, those who were not at the top table when we put in place the present architecture after the Second World War are beginning to ask themselves some questions, well, why them and why not us? We have got the rise, the emergence of major powers, big economies, who are understandably saying, well, we think that we should be part of these big international organizations as well. I don't think any of us feel that we should oppose that trend. We want to hang on to the values which are dear to us and which are represented by, we like to think, the core membership of a number of those organizations that you value. We want to have more free trade. We want to ensure the Security Council of the United Nations is able to do its job. Equally, we have to adjust. We've had to adjust on a de facto, if not a de jure way at the moment, the G7, G8 in response to events in Ukraine. Recently, we have to be flexible. We are looking at the revision of IMF quotas, IMF reform, which we think is important. Actually, I think it's important for the United States as well. It got stuck in Congress recently when it got tied up with a number of other issues, including financial support for Ukraine. But we think that is the right way to go. And we are open, provided everybody else is content with it, with the concept of a degree of Security Council and United Nations reform. How and at what speed and with which countries we need to go cautiously and ensure that, as you say, we don't lose what is valuable. But I'm quite sure, my government's quite sure, that we do need to adjust the global architecture to take account of these new realities, not least the enormously important role which China can play and we like to think will want to play as it assumes a greater sense of international responsibility in the years to come.
We, on security, finally, we have close cooperation, closely aligned interests. I was in the NSC in the Bush administration when we had a very difficult negotiation with the North Koreans in Pyongyang in 2002 in order to send our cable back to Washington. This was when the North Koreans revealed to us that they had this uranium enrichment program. We used your mission in Pyongyang. And so FCO, your embassy here, knew the results of our negotiations before our State Department did. We have that level of trust and
doesn't often
independence.
happen.
I have to complain, though. We had been negotiating all day with no food. We went to your mission in Pyongyang. We did the cable, and the only thing the ambassador could offer us was single malt whiskey. No one complained about that. And Walker's Haggis-flavored crisps. Walker's Haggis-flavored crisps were not exactly the thing we'd been envisioning in our hunger. Anyway, with that level of cheek-to-jowl cooperation. But while our interests align, the United States has security commitments. We have security treaties with Japan, with Korea, with Australia, and so forth. So it's a little bit like the chicken who has an interest in what's for breakfast and the pig who has a vital interest in what's for breakfast. So President Obama made a very robust statement of support for the U.S.-Japan alliance in Tokyo. Very robust. I think our friends in China were a bit surprised. How can Britain and Europe more generally contribute to, if not resolution, management and de-escalation and some confidence building in some of these island disputes. You said clearly, and I appreciated this very much, that the UK shares our interest in diplomatic resolutions and so forth, but is there some role you can imagine for Europe or for Britain, either in the ASEAN Regional Forum discussions or in the ASEM, EU, Asian discussions or other ways, to help lean in with us to try to calm the situation?
I think that is what we should be doing, and I think that is what we are trying to do. We don't have exactly the same treaty obligations in the region, although we do have in Southeast Asia anyway the 5 power agreements, of which the United Kingdom is a party. But I think that we lend our weight collectively in the European Union and bilaterally through the exchanges that we have been having and the visit of my Prime Minister that I mentioned at the end of last year. And we've had a bunch of very high-level visitors since then, senior ministers, and our people-to-people dialogue and other exchanges. We can use the links that we have got to try to reinforce those same messages. That is to say, we're not addressing quite the same questions of alliance commitments and so on as the President was, but we do share very much his view that where there are issues, where there are disputes, they should not be resolved in any way unilaterally, that there should be dialogue and discussion, that there is every advantage in de-escalation, and in not immediately reaching for the militarized solution to this. So we are talking to all of our friends in the region as well as your friends in the region from that very same perspective. We don't think that there is anything to be gained from increasing of tensions, whether it's the South China Sea, the East China Sea, or of other sorts, reactions to different policy decisions and statements from different governments. We know there's a complicated history, but we think, just as we in Europe have had to put complicated and difficult history behind us, it is time for the countries in the region to do so as well. So I think the links that we've got, those business links, those political links, those indispensable, to coin a phrase, relationships that I was touching on just now, we aim to use those in order to convey precisely the same messages that the President has been doing, the Vice President has been doing on their recent visits. And I think that the closer we are able to engage and to discuss and to show understanding of the different issues and both sides of the story, hopefully the greater the possibility of these issues being resolved in a manner which is much less tense and of achieving a degree of de-escalation.
Well, thank you, Ambassador. It's encouraging that we are both pivoting to Asia together. 10 years ago, the transatlantic relationship hit the shoals over China policy because of the EU arms embargo issue. Washington did not want the embargo lifted. There was strong momentum in the European Union among member states to lift it. Britain played a critical role in bridging that gap. I think it's essential for all of us that the U.S. and Europe are speaking with one voice in both senses of our relationship with China. The hope for success, for a more comprehensive and positive relationship, but the importance of maintaining diplomatic answers to international problems and effective rules for governing trade and investment and so forth. And you've conveyed that very effectively today. So on behalf of Georgetown and Georgetown and USIP, I think CSIS and USIP have the same architect. It's spectacular here.
Spectacular.
So on behalf of Georgetown and USIP, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Okay.
Appreciate it.
I better run away. Thank you very much. Thanks. Thank you.
Gulf War. They voted for Resolution 1386, authorizing the International Security Assistance Force in Afghanistan. So China sort of basically wants credit for not blocking the United States with that position. But of course, the list of vetoes doesn't reflect situations in which China wielded influence with its threat of a veto, or otherwise may have informally influenced the behavior or actions of other members. Moving on to China as rule maker. Many observers have remarked on an apparent gradual shift in China's attitude toward the international system in the last few years. A desire to move cautiously beyond the Deng Xiaoping dictum of Tao Guang Yang Hui, this idea that China should keep its head down, not take the lead, focus on domestic development. And that dictum has been in place since the fall of the Soviet Union. It's still officially there, but there's now a lot of debate about how much China should feel guided by that. We're seeing senior Chinese officials indicating a desire to pursue gradual changes to the international system. An example, November 2013, last year, State Councilor Yang Jiechi, China's most senior diplomat, stated that China wants to, quote, pursue incremental progress in adjusting and reforming the international system. That appears to mean preserving the authority of the United Nations and the World Trade Organization, but wanting the UN to renew and improve itself and play a bigger role. It means securing a greater role for emerging markets and developing countries in the global system, for example, the G20. China really likes the G20. Reforming the international monetary and financial systems to give China a bigger role. Ensuring a global development agenda that is firmly focused on economic development and poverty alleviation and not on promoting democracy, democratic governance. China is also engaged in a parallel effort to create new institutions in which China can be a rule maker from the start. One example is the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Its mission includes, quote, moving towards the establishment of a new democratic, just and rational political and economic international order. Principles of the SCO include ideas like respect for the diversity of cultures, which is a byword for not pursuing democracy promotion in places like China. It's also got a major focus on tackling what the SCO countries call terrorism, separatism, and extremism. And that, of course, just that formulation reflects China's role as a rule maker in this situation. China, of course, uses that phrase, the terrorism, separatism, and extremism, to justify its actions in places like Xinjiang and Tibet. And it calls those three things the three evils. And yet, the SCO, all of the SCO countries have signed on to that focus. And the SCO countries, Kazakhstan, China, Kyrgyz Republic, Russia, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan. Observers are Afghanistan, India, Iran, Mongolia, and Pakistan. China's also seeking to be a rule maker in the context of the BRICS, the BRICS grouping, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. It has established the China-Africa Cooperation Forum and now expanded on. We now have also a China-Arab Cooperation Forum, and looks like this year there will be a new
and has interviewed and translated for, or interpreted for several Chinese high-level officials, American high-level officials. Patrick Clausen, like me, is not fluent in Mandarin. He's fluent in Pentagonese, which is an equally different tonal language, and it's hard because it changes all the time. Those acronyms just keep getting longer and longer. He is now Senior Director and Director of the Asia Program at CNAS, the Center for New American Security. If you look at his longer bio, you'll see he's been in a number of places and has always written very, very cogently about U.S. national security, in particular about Asian issues. So with that, let me turn this over to Susan, and we'll get started talking about China as a rule maker.
I'd like to start by thanking Georgetown, Oriana, and USIP for the invitation to be here. And I'm speaking in my personal capacity, and my views don't necessarily represent those of CRS. This panel is on China as rule maker. The framing language that you will have seen in the brochure about the conference seemed to assign two meanings to that phrase. The first one was China as joiner, as participant in the international system, epitomized by its decision to join most international and regional organizations. And the second meaning is China as rule maker in the international system, in the sense of playing a leadership role, actively proposing changes to the international order. So I'm going to split my remarks into those two categories. Starting with China as joiner. China has been an enthusiastic joiner in recent decades, making up for time lost as the junior partner in the Sino-Soviet alliance and in the aftermath of the Korean War. China, of course, joined the United Nations and took on the seat on the Security Council held by the Republic of China, Taiwan in 1971. Its membership in international organizations picked up after 1978. It has now joined most UN-affiliated agencies, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and so on. It began efforts to join the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade in 1986, and finally joined the GATT's successor organization, the World Trade Organization, of course, in 2001. Nonetheless, for most of the time since 1971, China has often been described as under-participating in global governance. A 2009 study by the Center for American Progress described China as in the ring, but punching below its weight. Chinese scholars have characterized China's role differently, as admirably restrained. Chinese scholars sometimes seek appreciation for the fact that China has generally not sought to use its UN Security Council seat, for example, as a way to counterbalance or block the United States. One imperfect metric of China's activity may be vetoes in the UN Security Council. China cast its first veto in 1972, blocking Bangladesh's UN membership because China considered Bangladesh to be a breakaway province of Pakistan, its ally. But it didn't use its veto again for 25 years, until 1997, when it vetoed a resolution to send ceasefire observers to Guatemala because of Guatemala's diplomatic relations with Taiwan. And China abstained on the 1991 Gulf War resolution, allowing the Gulf War to happen. They voted for the ultimatum to Iraq leading up to the second.
I think it's even with papers.
So you mean, so you're timing this to work here? Because I didn't time my remarks. What's the best way to time? Well, you say, right, I know. But nobody does. So at about 12 minutes. You'll hold that up. I'd rather not do. Well, they're doing me Are you leaving immediately afterwards? No, I don't have to rush out. Okay. You can praise this afterwards. Georgetown signed their common front of the USIP. It's good.
Oh, here it is. Well, let us start the second session, if we will, please. My name's Tom McNair. I teach in the Security Studies program at Georgetown. And I have anticipated this panel in particular with great interest because, as sort of your typical American national security analyst, I think of China as a rule breaker more than a rule maker, and I think it's a stroke of genius to sort of put this panel here so we can talk about the other side of that coin. And to do that, we have three really terrific, experienced panelists. I'll introduce them in the order in which they're sitting, which is also in the order in which they're speaking, with the only admonition that we do try to hold to 10 to 15 minutes, which, as I told the panelists, it's just impossible. Nobody speaks for just 10 minutes, but I'd like you to really give it a try. Susan Lawrence is at the Congressional Research Service, where she's an Asia specialist. She lived in China for 13 years, most of that as a journalist for the likes of the Far Eastern Economic Review, Wall Street Journal, the U.S. News and World Report. Fluent in Mandarin, and I think probably fluent in the way China sees the world and sees itself as well. Robert Daly is the director of the Kissinger Center on the U.S. and China at the Woodrow Wilson Center. Came down there just last year from Maryland, where he ran the China Project, but about 11 years in China, including 6 directing the Nanjing Center, which I regard as a very special place. Again, fluent in Mandarin.